Danganronpa 2 Goodbye Despair has a cast full of unique and interesting personalities, some less unique than others of course, but it still stands that each member offers something new to the game, and most deserve the praise they get. There is, however, one character who I feel far too often gets the short end of the stick when it comes to receiving the appreciation they deserve, and that character is Hiyoko Sayunji, the ultimate traditional dancer.
Hiyoko, at least from what I've seen, appears to be one of, if not the most overhated characters in the series, though I would say that she's one of my favorites.
One of the biggest complaints towards Hiyoko's character that I often see is that she's a bully to everybody. She doesn't tend to hold back when insulting characters like Byakuya, Kazuichi, Akane, Ibuki, and especially Mikan. The second complaint I see often is that Hiyoko isn't a very useful character in general. And while I can see where this complaint is coming from, I must disagree with it. I plan on getting to the bullying complaint later, once I go further into Hiyoko's character. But for now, I'll be addressing why I disagree completely with the usefulness claim. Hiyoko is a character who takes every opportunity she sees to insult one of her fellow classmates. While there are a lot of these moments, in and out of the trials, there's an argument to be made that Sayunji does indeed take the killing game as seriously as those around her, if not more than most characters actually. Hiyoko proved she comprehends the gravity of the killing game immediately after Byakuya gets killed. She's the first to admit that they have to investigate Byakuya's murder to stay alive. And aside from her bullying during the trial, she tries her best to contribute to solving the murder. Of course, Chapter 2's murder and investigation is a completely different story, and I do intend on getting to it later. First, however, I plan on mentioning Hiyoko's bullying, but only in the context of the trials. In general, Hiyoko's comments aren't very interruptive of the flow of the trials. They also tend to be varied enough to not feel repetitive. In the same realm as Hiyoko's bullying, most characters have similar trial interjections while also consistently helping out. There's Nekomaru with his shit jokes, Kazuichi with his constant Miss Sonia gag. Akane never fails to make a few stupid jokes during trials, and then there's Gundam, Ibuki, and Sonia in the same realm. While you can easily prop up the argument that these characters' interjections were not as bad as Hiyoko's bullying, that's purely subjective. It's very odd to me that Hiyoko gets singled out in this regard when a ton of the cast is responsible for similar behavior during the trials. As I mentioned previously, it's necessary to analyze Hiyoko's role in the second class trial for a specific reason. In this trial, she's framed for the murder of her only friend during the killing game, Mahiru Koizumi. Understanding Hiyoko's situation here isn't very difficult. Of course, she isn't going to assist in the investigation. Not only did she want to keep suspicion away from herself so that the real Blacken can be discovered after she'd been framed, she was grieving the loss of the one person she could trust during the killing game, who'd been abruptly taken away from her. Hiyoko staying away from the scene the whole time was arguably beneficial to the investigation as well. The Blacken could have easily made the claim that Hiyoko returned to the scene in order to tamper with evidence that might have incriminated her further. That, or Hiyoko could have discovered the gummy in the closet and gotten rid of it so that people wouldn't suspect her. Especially seeing as the color of the gummy was one of the big factors that proved Hiyoko was actually innocent. Overall, Hiyoko remaining at the scene of the crime during the investigation would have been a generally bad thing. The best thing Hiyoko could have possibly done in this instance was testify about what she saw and what happened when she went to the beach house, which is what she gladly did when she was proven innocent. As it's been proven, Hiyoko takes the killing game just as seriously as the majority of the cast for the cases that she's alive. Of course, she's unable to assist to the extent of those most helpful in the trials throughout the series, but seeing as she tries to assist in both the trials and the investigations, that's clearly not a fault that lies on her character. Given the fact that her not being able to do much in the way of helping in trials ties into her backstory and character, as will be discussed later, really adds to keep her character consistent, which is completely more ideal than ignoring that aspect of her character completely. So while Hiyoko is as useful as she can be, it's arguably better that she's not overly helpful. Hiyoko's past is explored in great detail in her free time events, and they offer a whole new perspective on her actions throughout the main game. Hiyoko mentions that she hates her family name due to the negative aspects that usually come with it. In Hiyoko's free time events, we learn that she was taken away from her parents in order to be raised by her grandmother. This was because the Saiyonji clan is a long line of people who share the talent of traditional dancing. Hiyoko's grandmother wanted her to become a dancer as well. Hiyoko mentions that everyone with the Saiyonji name eventually dies a crazy death by being targeted by those who envy their talent. Hiyoko goes on to mention that she has been targeted numerous times in the past. She mentions how people would put pins in her shoes, scatter dead mice on her bed, try dropping stage lights onto her, and poison her food as well. All of these actions attempted against her by those around her led her to becoming the Hiyoko we see in DR2. She doesn't bully those around her for the fun of it as it might initially seem. Right after talking about all the things that happened to her, Hiyoko talks about a story of a father who acts insane to protect his daughter. However, despite Hiyoko clearly having a fond relationship with her father, she grew up primarily with her grandmother.
Just like how the father in the story acts in a way to assure nobody comes close to his daughter,
Hiyoko actively bullies other people to push them away from her and put up a facade of strength. She bullies people as a way to appear stronger than she really is. She tries preventing herself from being hurt the way she had been prior,
concealing a part of her personality only to be shown to those she truly trusts.
Hiyoko actually very seldomly cries before Mahiru dies. Once being during the first trial where she says she wants to go home, and the second one I believe is very telling about her character. At the beginning of Chapter 2, multiple characters mention that Hiyoko smells bad. This is because she hadn't cleaned herself since coming to Jabberwock. The reason for that being her inability to tie her own kimono. This is the second instance of Hiyoko crying, and one of the only times she cries before Mahiru's death. The thing that makes Hiyoko stop here is Mahiru stepping in and offering to teach her how to tie her kimono.
The fact that Hiyoko made such a big deal in this situation that she burst into tears might only appear like she's upset and crying because people are telling her she smells bad. But under the context of what she says in her free time events, it's heavily implied that there's an alternate reason that gives this moment more depth. Hiyoko mentions, after talking about how her grandma took her away from her parents, that her grandma took good care of her because she was supposed to be the next head of the family. This is very telling because it suggests that her grandma wanted Hiyoko to remain dependent on her, and, by extension, dependent on the clan itself. Seeing as Hiyoko cried when her inability to tie her own kimono came up, her tears were due to her being ashamed of how incompetent she is when it comes to doing so many things. More evidence that shows her grandmother intentionally kept Hiyoko dependent is in Chapter 3 when her classmates misunderstand the intention behind the shrine she built for Mahiru. Hiyoko talks about how she knows she's not really good at anything besides dancing, which would line up with what we know about how Hiyoko was raised by her grandmother, whose only intention was for her to become a dancer. In fact, it's very likely that her being intentionally sheltered and kept dependent all her life led to her becoming and remaining somewhat childish, especially compared to her classmates. Seeing as Hiyoko admits to not having the best relationship with her grandmother compared to her father suggests that Hiyoko doesn't like how dependent she needs to be on others. Hiyoko is shown on various occasions to prefer to be independent, which is one of the reasons why she pushes everyone away, even in the third chapter when she resolves to stop bullying those around her. She mentions in her free time events how she doesn't like the concept of friends, despite befriending both Hajime and Mahiru, and she refuses help from Sonia when she offers to help Hiyoko tie her kimono in Chapter 3. This is for two reasons. Hiyoko doesn't want things done for her. She wants to learn how to do things on her own. One of the reasons Hiyoko decided to accept help from Mahiru was because Mahiru was offering to teach her. Another reason Hiyoko refused help from Sonia was because Hiyoko felt obliged to carry on what Mahiru taught her. She wanted to be able to do something on her own without the outside help she'd been forced to rely on all her life. Hiyoko even says right after Nekomaru gets shot by Monokuma that she never wants to rely on anybody again. All of this sadly ended up being her demise. Hiyoko's father seems to have played a big part in her life, being one of the few people that she idolizes. She mentions how he married into the family, meaning he isn't a Saiyonji. And based on what Hiyoko says, it seems like her father was a good role model who was supportive of her talent. Given that Hiyoko takes an immediate liking to Mahiru, it's more than likely that she reminded Hiyoko of her father. This would suggest that Hiyoko's father was also teaching her how to do things for herself before she got taken away by her grandmother. Hiyoko mentions that her father didn't care too much for traditional dancing as a whole, but he made an effort to go see Hiyoko's performances, which shows how supportive he was of what she wanted to do. The fact that Hiyoko's father isn't very knowledgeable about Hiyoko's talent is probably one of the main reasons that Hiyoko went to live with her grandmother. He probably thought it was best to send her there in order to support Hiyoko's interest of becoming a traditional dancer, just like her relatives. He allowed Hiyoko to live with her grandmother because he thought it was in her best interest. Yet, as it's been discussed, it resulted in Hiyoko needing to fill the role of her own father and start pushing others away, as well as having her grandmother prevent her from learning basic skills like tying her own kimono. Even still, seeing as Hiyoko never speaks ill about her father and mentions that he attends her performances, it's clear that she doesn't dislike him for allowing her to live with her grandmother. Her father clearly remains to be one of the most important people in Hiyoko's life and someone she idolizes and respects above all others. Hiyoko interacts with most of the cast for the brief screen time she has, and grows varying relationships with them depending on what she thinks of them. Many of her interactions, of course, is her making fun of those around her, but she does have a few friendships with people she truly enjoys being around. Those being Mahiru Koizumi and, in her free time events, Hajime Hinata. It's important to look at how Hiyoko acts towards those around her in order to 1. See if many of them take Hiyoko's jabs at them as malicious, and 2. See what her comments say about her character. Other than Mikan, who we'll discuss in a little bit, the first person Hiyoko makes fun of directly is Kazuichi Soda. Hiyoko tells him that his flashy appearance is just for show, and that deep down he's truly a coward. This is a very interesting comment because it's practically hitting the nail on the head of Kazuichi's true personality. You learn in his free time events that this is exactly the case for Kazuichi. He says he views himself as cowardly, and the reason he dyed his hair and changed everything about his appearance was because he was too scared to get close to anybody after he'd been betrayed. This instance, coupled with Hiyoko being the only one to acknowledge her understanding that Mikan is falling for attention, an aspect about her you also learn in her free time events, makes it clear that despite her bullying, Hiyoko has a clear understanding of what the actions of those around her say about them. This aspect of her character actually makes the fact that she's constantly pushing everyone away sadder. This is because she understands them all as people, but yet due to her past, she's predisposed to torment them so they don't view her as weak. The fact that Hiyoko is able to comprehend those around her to this caliber can only indicate that it became a necessity for her to become a good analyzer of character. Likely because she herself got close to people who ended up betraying her, as she mentions in her free time events. As it stands, Kazuichi is one of the 2 people who Hiyoko torments that seems actually affected by what she's saying to him. Even Tugami, who, after Hiyoko gives him the nickname Ham Hands, mentions that Hiyoko is observant. On the topic of Tugami, one of the bigger complaints about Hiyoko's actions is that she disrespects Tugami by calling him Ham Hands after he dies. This is a common misunderstanding about Hiyoko's character. Tugami mentions after she gives him that nickname that he's completely fine with being called that, and perhaps he's always yearned for it. Tugami actually seems like one of the people that Hiyoko respects. Aside from the nickname, she doesn't really tend to make fun of him. As I mentioned earlier, Hiyoko was one of the first to insist that they investigate his murder. And after the class trial, she reiterates that it's okay to feel sad about Tugami's death, and that Teruhiro's actions as Tugami's killer is completely unforgivable. This shows how, despite the way she pushes everyone away, Hiyoko is generally non-forgiving and intolerant of people who do things she views as wrong. However, after Mahiru dies, we see multiple instances of Hiyoko attempting to change her way of thinking and start forgiving others more. The first instance of this is at the start of chapter 3 when everyone sees the shrine she made for Mahiru and thinks it's cursed. Hiyoko was clearly really hurt by this before Chiaki pointed out that it was made with good intentions in mind. Hiyoko understood where they were coming from because she knew that she's not really that great at anything besides dancing, and she chooses to forgive them for the misunderstanding. The second instance of this is of course about Fuyuhiko. Hiyoko, in line with how she felt about Teruhiro after he died, refused to accept his apology. She blamed him for the death of Mahiru and Peko up until 2 things happened that made her reconsider. One of those 2 things was Fuyuhiko stabbing himself, and the other was Chiaki asking Hiyoko to consider what Mahiru would do in that situation. Despite not ever outright forgiving Fuyuhiko for his actions, Hiyoko stops blaming him and even attends and enjoys his welcome back party. This really shows how hard she was trying to change. The fact that she was inclined to begrudgingly accept the apology of the one who took her best friend away from her, as well as trying her hardest to better herself, says a lot about how much she valued Mahiru's friendship and ideals. Of course, something important happens that somewhat makes Hiyoko revert back to her old way of thinking, but not entirely, of course. And that has to do with another character that Hiyoko has a few interactions with. Generally, Akane is one of the characters who just doesn't seem to care whenever Hiyoko insults her, but they do share one interaction that says a lot about Hiyoko's character. That moment being right after Ibuki's party for Fuyuhiko, when Akane went to try fighting Monokuma, and Nekomaru sacrificed himself for her. His actions here made Hiyoko reconsider getting close to anybody else on the island. She mentioned she doesn't want to die a pointless death, and that this is what happens when she lets her guard down. This is a key moment when Hiyoko, just after she stopped pushing everyone away by bullying so that she isn't viewed as being weak and an easy target, started pushing everyone away for a completely different reason. She didn't want to lose anyone close to her again like she lost Mahiru, so her decision was to stop letting people get close to her in general. She viewed herself as Akane in this situation. If she let someone get close to her like Akane did with Nekomaru, they'd end up sacrificing themselves for her just like Nekomaru did with Akane. Another kind of loss like that is something Hiyoko couldn't take. This is exactly why Hiyoko so heavily blamed Akane for Nekomaru having to make that sacrifice for her sake. It was because of Nekomaru's friendship that he chose to value Akane's life over his own. Hiyoko blamed Akane for letting Nekomaru get close to her. If Hiyoko really were as evil and manipulative as people say she is, she would have used the situation to get close to somebody in hopes they might eventually be used to her as a sacrifice. But Hiyoko doesn't want that at all. The relationship she actually had was something she clearly valued a lot, and looking into her character, it's become clear that she was one of the people that the killing game affected the most. She clearly respected Dugami before he died, and despite not outright conveying her sadness, she says she understands that people would be sad about the loss of him. And of course, nobody conveyed as much emotion and respect towards the loss of Mahiru as Hiyoko did. But it's implied that Hiyoko was also affected by the loss of Peko to a lesser extent. And Nekomaru's sacrifice seemed to have almost as much of an impact on Hiyoko as it had on Akane, if not more, actually. She clearly values the lives of those around her and refuses to let one of them become just another sacrifice for her sake. Further proof of this is later in the chapter when they find out about the despair disease. Hiyoko was the one to come up with a game plan for what they needed to do about Monokuma's latest motive. She wanted to prevent any more deaths, so she's the first to take initiative and suggest isolation of those who've interacted with the patients of the despair disease. She also suggests finding a way for them to keep contact without physically interacting. Something of interest to note is that Fuyuhiko, who Hiyoko suggested before what happened to Nekomaru would be the first person to get cut off if anything happens, volunteered on his own to help Hajime and Mikan look after the despair disease patients. Despite being the one to order Hajime and Mikan stay at the hospital, she didn't even consider making Fuyuhiko do anything. She's clearly flustered that Fuyuhiko found it necessary to offer to put himself in danger of catching the disease in order to help Hajime and Mikan. Based on the fact that she says earlier in the chapter that he's likely faking his own apologeticness to manipulate them, she likely didn't expect him to go out of his way to help out just to show he truly wanted to get along with everyone. Another important thing to note about Hiyoko's character after what happened to Nekomaru is the pure fact that she locked herself up in her motel room after the despair disease started. When, by her own conveyed knowledge of how diseases spread, she should have been safe interacting with the others. If she truly was scared of catching despair disease, she wouldn't have left her room at all, even to go to the music venue to try tying her kimono on her own. She likely wouldn't have even gotten as close as she did to Mikan, Hajime, and the despair disease patients if she was that worried about catching it. After Hiyoko dies, Sonia talks about suggesting that Hiyoko staying locked up in her room all day is bad for her health. After suggesting this, Hiyoko kicked her out. Hiyoko didn't seem worried about catching the disease from Sonia when she walked in.
She only got flustered when Sonia suggested leaving her room more often. This just shows that it was never catching anything from interacting with others that was an issue for her. It was the idea of interacting with others itself that led her to isolate. This is all evidence to suggest that Hiyoko didn't want to get close to anyone else so she wouldn't have to feel the pain of losing them in the same way she lost Mahiru. Mikan and Hiyoko's relationship is a very weird one. As mentioned earlier, Hiyoko clearly understands Mikan as a person, but she's the one person Hiyoko never stops tormenting. It's actually quite interesting that Hiyoko insists on singling out Mikan in many instances, because their pasts do have a fair amount of parallels when you compare them. They're both insecure about themselves and they both have an unideal home life. They've each been put through what's practically torture comparing Mikan's past with Hiyoko's. As a result of similar treatment, however, they both became what are practically opposites. One pushes everyone away from her by bullying them, and the other craves attention above all else, and is perfectly fine with being tormented as long as it means she's getting any attention at all. In a weird way, Hiyoko and Mikan go together really well. In fact, this is the main reason Hiyoko targets Mikan more than anybody else. Hiyoko and Mikan have very similar paths, and based on Hiyoko's clear conveyance of understanding people, she understands this about Mikan as well. The reason Hiyoko bullies Mikan isn't due to their similarities, however, it's due to their differences. Hiyoko used her past to become the person she is now, someone who refuses to let herself get close to others. Someone who tries her hardest to push everyone away. Someone who's been clearly betrayed in the past and doesn't want a repeat of that. Someone who will cherish the relationship she does make. Mikan is the exact opposite of this. She too used her past to become the way we see her. Someone who, completely unlike Hiyoko, is all too eager to get close to others no matter what they do. Mikan wants attention so much she's willing to allow people to bully her. Someone who's been betrayed in the past but chooses to get really close to them after only hanging out with them a few times. In fact, Mikan accepts Hajime's proposal in her island mode ending, being the only character in the series that this happens to. She consistently keeps opening herself up to get betrayed again, something Hiyoko would never do. Mikan even considers Hiyoko a friend, despite not receiving a single positive comment from her the entire game. This is in stark contrast with Hiyoko, who only considers Mahiru her friend. Hiyoko sees someone who's been betrayed in the past and just keeps opening herself up again, and she resents that. Despite their similarities, it's the fact that Mikan constantly does the one thing that Hiyoko would never do, and that's why Hiyoko hates her for it. It's really telling of both of their characters. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum to Hiyoko's relationship with Mikan, there's her relationship with Mahiru. Mahiru is the one person Hiyoko would never even think to speak ill about. As mentioned earlier, Mahiru reminded Hiyoko of her father. This is because Mahiru taught Hiyoko how to do things that she never learned while being raised by her grandma. In general, Mahiru just taught Hiyoko to become a better person. Mahiru's death very clearly affected Hiyoko a lot. Hiyoko going out of her way to make a shrine for Mahiru in order to tell her that she's not alone, even in heaven, despite Hiyoko admitting it was clumsily made, shows just how much Hiyoko cared about their friendship. It's the thought that Hiyoko put into making it that counts, and it's clear that Hiyoko put a lot of thought in. Side note, Hiyoko's shrine seems to have actually worked to some capacity. Aside from the cottage doors, it's the only interactable item at the end of Chapter 5 that displays a glitchy message. So, in a sense, it seems Hiyoko was doing something right when she made that shrine. Something interesting to note about Hiyoko and Mahiru's relationship is how different they really are. Mahiru idolizes her mother, and Hiyoko idolizes her father. Mahiru understands Teru's motive, and she feels bad for him, yet Hiyoko refuses to feel empathy for him. Mahiru displays that she cares deeply for everyone, and Hiyoko actively tries to show that she doesn't care about anyone, except of course, Mahiru herself.
In the second class trial, there's an interesting interaction that puts a large portion of Hiyoko's character in a different light. Hiyoko talks about how much she cares about Mahiru, mentioning how nice of a person she is, and then immediately after, she snaps at Mikan. I find this interaction really telling because we know that Hiyoko is forcing herself to bully others. We know that she likes Mahiru for her kindness, and we know that Hiyoko tries to change her way by thinking, what would Mahiru do after she dies? This all heavily suggests that Hiyoko really dislikes the part of her that pushes everyone away. It's why she breaks her ideal of what she thinks friends are, which she mentions in her free time events. The fact that she becomes friends with Mahiru, who's so different from her in so many ways, is very interesting to me. Hiyoko forces herself to push everyone away, and yet those she holds close to her, those she respects and idolizes, Mahiru and her father, are both shown to be very good people at heart. And it's clear that Hiyoko wishes to be that way as well. If she weren't held back by her predisposition to bully those around her, if she hadn't been betrayed so many times in the past, she would clearly be the person she prefers to be, someone more akin to Mahiru and her father. She even shows glimpses of opening up and conveying that she has a serious side in her free time events. She goes in depth about things she appreciates, like flowers, refined Japanese cuisine, and how she believes that it's important to take good care of and protect what's close to her. Even understanding that her way of thinking must be old-fashioned due to how she was raised. The fact that she's so inclined to hold people like Mahiru and her father so close to her shows that she stays true to those ideals. It indicates she wasn't always a bully to everyone and everything around her, and that before she was made to live with her grandma, she was a normal kid who liked what any kid would like. On the topic, I think it's worth mentioning Hajime's relationship with Hiyoko that develops during her free time events. Seeing her relationship with Hajime is important because it's an interesting differentiation from how Hiyoko treats everyone else. She clearly doesn't put him at the same level she views her father and Mahiru, which makes Hajime a very unique case. During her first two free time events, she outright bullies Hajime. She goes out of her way to insult him and annoy him. This is what she does to everyone, but the more Hajime hangs out with her, the more she starts to open up. On her third free time event, she tells him about the Saionji clan, her past, her grandma, her father, and the terrible things that people tried to do to her. And yet, she quickly becomes wary of opening up too much and reverts back to her usual self. During her fourth free time event, she opens up more about her ideals and the things she likes. And after mentioning that Hajime reminds Hiyoko of her father, she invites him to one of her performances. And in her final free time event, she talks about how good it is that Hajime is so kind-hearted. Once again, we see Hiyoko gravitate to those who are so different from the way she acts, further displaying that Hiyoko's bullying is only that, an act. Hajime's free time events with Hiyoko do a really good job at showing that if others see through Hiyoko's facade and give her the time of day, that she's capable of showing she has a more serious side to her. She clearly enjoys the company immensely. This means that even though Hiyoko pushes everyone away, deep down she desires attention to the same extent that Mikan does. Overall, I think it's a certainty that Hiyoko has a lot of unique and interesting dynamics and interactions with others. They each provide a lot of insight to her ideals, her motivations, and her past. Hiyoko, quite unfortunately, was abruptly killed off in the story midway through her development in Chapter 3, which I personally believe was the completely wrong place to take the story, especially with where her character was going. Not only did her death not really say anything new about her character aside from her mere action of trying to honor what Mahiru taught her, Hiyoko's death wasn't as meaningful in general as characters that were killed before and after her. In fact, it's one of the two deaths in the series where the victim died by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. As a whole, Chapter 3 is just a very clearly rushed chapter. Aside from having Mikan's speedy actions be impossible, the murder weapon for Hiyoko not discussed at all, and the least amount of panels in a closing argument in the series, despite the case's complexity, Hiyoko wasn't even initially supposed to die. The story was changed to let this happen, however. In an interview, the writer of Danganronpa, Kazutaka Kodaka, stated that Chapter 3 was supposed to have either Nekomaru or Fuyuhiko die in place of Hiyoko, but the story was tweaked, and as a result, she was killed off.
Ideally, I would say that only one murder in Chapter 3 would be fine, because Fuyuhiko is easily one of the best Tier 2 characters. Compared to one other character who is in a similar situation to Hiyoko in terms of losing their friends and dying the next chapter, Kiyotaka, I would argue that Hiyoko's character had more places to go and that she deserved to survive more than any other character who's died in the series. Her character arc could have gone in so many different ways based on how we last see her before she dies. It's possible that her pushing everyone away could be brought to an end when Nekomaru returns at the end of Chapter 3 as a robot. She could start opening up to others more and continue trying her hardest to stop bullying her classmates. There's just a lot of different places to take her character that would work decently well based on how her development was already progressing. And yet, we never get to see any of this. The fact that Hiyoko was getting development as a whole would have made the game so much better to me, because in terms of survivors, the only ones who got any notable development was Hajime and Fuyuhiko. Hiyoko's being the only one to get their development cut off. Hiyoko could also easily work well in conjunction with other characters. Her dynamic with Fuyuhiko is already really interesting, but there's no doubt that they could potentially bond over both losing the people closest to them at some point, if they both survived. I think they could each play into each other's character development really well. Not only this, but as I mentioned earlier, Nekomaru's eventual return could easily play into changing Hiyoko's mind on pushing everyone away. His sacrifice was the reason she went back to doing so in the first place. As it was already, I feel her character meshes with and plays off the rest of the cast really well, and with the added screen time if she were to survive, I think her character would be at its best. One thing I see every time the topic comes to who should have survived in Chapter 3, Hiyoko or Fuyuhiko, is how Pekko's sacrifice meant too much for Fuyuhiko to just get killed in the very next chapter. I do agree with this point. I like both characters a lot and think they each deserved a spot in the surviving cast. Despite this, I think arguing that Fuyuhiko deserved it more is being really ignorant of Hiyoko's situation. They were each deeply flawed as people who would each be insulting to their classmates. They each lost someone really close to them and they each got character growth as a result. The single difference in the two was that Hiyoko didn't have any way of preventing herself from losing her closest friend. Unlike Hiyoko, Fuyuhiko was the one to plan to murder someone out of spite. Fuyuhiko's actions required Pekko to intervene to protect him. And unlike Pekko, Mahiru didn't get a choice to protect her best friend. I'm in no way saying that Fuyuhiko shouldn't have been forgiven for his actions. But it's inarguable that Fuyuhiko put himself in a situation where Pekko felt the need to sacrifice herself for him. As a result, Hiyoko, who was completely innocent in the situation, was tricked and kidnapped by Pekko. She was framed for her best friend's murder. And yet, for some reason, people still complain that Hiyoko didn't completely forgive Fuyuhiko without question within a few days after this all happened, which to me is one of the most absurdly arbitrary complaints against her character. Regardless, as the surviving cast is currently, the members represent one side of all the dynamics in the game. Hajime had a dynamic with Komaeda and Chiaki. Sonya had a dynamic with Gundam, Kane had a dynamic with Nekomaru, and Fuyuhiko had a dynamic with Pekko. Mahiru and Hiyoko's dynamic is the only defined dynamic in the game in which both members die before the end. Considering the fact that it was Mahiru's ideals and teachings that led to Hiyoko's development in the first place, it's an insult to Mahiru's legacy to kill Hiyoko off in the very next chapter. As a whole, Hiyoko's development, her potential dynamics with the survivors, and the fact that her survival would carry meaning for Mahiru, makes Hiyoko, in my eyes, easily deserving of a spot in the surviving cast. Hiyoko is a really unique character as a whole for a few reasons, one of which being her ability to analyze character. With many things, people included, she's able to prove she can clearly see the good and bad aspects. We see glimpses of this in her free time events with how she appreciates flowers and yet still calls them ugly. With many things, she's clearly able to see both the good and the bad, which also includes herself. Hiyoko has two sides to her. There's the side that just acts like a normal kid and enjoys what anyone would, like flowers and sweets. And because of her past, there's another side that she forces. The side of her that pushes everyone away so that she won't be betrayed again.
I've previously discussed how Hiyoko dislikes that part of her due to how she gravitates towards people who act the complete opposite of her. People who are really kind and caring. However, not only does Hiyoko dislike that part of herself, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that she doesn't like the nice part of herself either. In the beginning of Chapter 3, when the characters are calling her earnest and kind-hearted, she denies it and gets flustered. Later in the same chapter, after Nekomaru's sacrifice, she regrets opening up at all. Another moment is the moment I mentioned earlier when she's complimenting the flowers. She says she likes to stomp on them because she hates pretty things. Hiyoko is trying to hide the part of herself that acts the way she really feels. It's very likely she loathes that aspect of herself. This would line up with her past quite well. Considering we know that Hiyoko has a passion for her talent, and yet her talent itself caused her so much pain. It was because of her talent that her grandma took her away from her father. It was because of her talent that she was unable to learn so many basic things. It was because of her talent that she was betrayed so many times in the past. It was because of her talent that she pushes everyone away. Hiyoko's talent being a burden on her really fits with one of DR2's messages. It fits with the way DR2 explores the downsides of talent. The idea that sometimes it's better to not be locked to one thing. It ties into DR2's main theme of choosing your own future. Because, despite Hiyuko's passion for her own talent, it doesn't seem like she had a choice in what she wanted to do. And that on its own is the root of all of her problems. Her talent is bloodline-based, and seemingly it puts her life at risk. Considering, of course, the crazy deaths that have been consistent within the Saionji clan. Deaths caused by people envious of the Saionji's talent. The Saionji name is clearly something that bothers Hiyoko a lot. Both sides of her are in constant conflict with each other. It was her kind-heartedness, her passion for her talent that created the Hiyoko who pushes everyone away. And the other side, the side that cherishes her friendship with Mahiru. The side that would spend all night working on a shrine to honor the friend that she would never speak ill about. It was that side that led her to start pushing everyone away again after seeing Nekomaru's sacrifice. Hiyoko is at constant odds with herself and what she wants to be. She stops completely pushing everyone away during Chapter 3 by putting an end to her bullying, and yet she started avoiding others again after Nekomaru's sacrifice. Her development wasn't going to be a simple A to B by having a mean character just suddenly stop. It was going to be far more complex, which is something really realistic. People who try to change won't always be able to like a flip of a switch. It takes time. And sometimes, for whatever reason, something might halt that change. It's honestly more realistic than any other arc in the series due to how it's portrayed. Even despite her slight regression, it's still clear that Hiyoko's attempt to change wasn't worthless. It still did change her as a person. She stopped pushing people away via bullying and remained more open than she was before. Even after Nekomaru's sacrifice, despite still trying to prevent forming another true bond with anyone like she had with Mahiru. Overall, I would say Hiyoko is the most underrated character in the series, being a character who has a lot of hidden depth for someone who only lasts half the game. All of her actions add a lot to her character in conjunction with her backstory. This, coupled with her unique personality and multi-layered character arc that emphasizes how realistic she is, to me, makes Hiyoko one of the best characters in the series.